freedom fighters, freedom lovers, and those who just want stuff for free. Greetings and hello, it is I, your favorite obscure social studies teacher, teaching you the textbook and the 99.9% of stuff that they leave out, Mr. Palumbo, and this is the Professor Liberty Podcast. Thank you for tuning in, folks. You know I always appreciate it. The tens and tens of you across the fruited plain and even into the oceans beyond. Thank you for joining. Thank you for listening. The 144th episode, ladies and gentlemen. It's getting pretty deep. The library is extensive. Please go to previous episodes and take a look. I've got what they call in the business evergreen episodes because you can go back like a library if you want to learn economics, if you want to learn about geography, if you want to learn about political theory, if you want to learn about world history, U.S. history, the presidents. I've got something for you. Go back into the library of Professor Liberty and find something that you can look at. And I hope it's edifying, educational, because here at Professor Liberty, we seek to educate, inspire, and restore. Whew, that was a heck of an intro. If you'd like to email the show, the email is professorliberty1776@gmail.com. That's professorliberty1776@gmail.com. Send me your quandaries, your queries, your criticisms, your conundrums, your capitations. That got weird. Your capitulations, whatever you want, you just got to send it to professorliberty1776@gmail.com. Well, folks, we are continuing our series on pirates. Arr! Everybody say that together. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Arr! Yes, we are talking about pirates again today. In the previous episode, we discussed the system that brought pirates to be. You know, through Hollywood and literature, we think of pirates as these bloodthirsty, evil, outside of the system scallywags, and maybe that is true. But I wanted to show you, and I know I can get a little abstract here on Professor Liberty, so thank you, the dozens of people that listened to the previous podcast. I can tend to get a little in the weeds, but I wanted to show you that economics is the reason we had piracy then and the reason we have piracy today. They might have gotten rid of the eye patches and hooks, but we still have piracy today, and many reasons why it's because of demand and government regulation. In other words, folks, if there's someone who wants something, there will always be a provider at a certain price. Today, we're going to talk about the pirates themselves. Who became a pirate? What was life like on a pirate ship? Today's episode is called Profits, Plunder, and Power, the system that the pirates built. So in the last episode, we talked about mostly the Caribbean in the 17th century and how it wasn't just ocean. There were invisible highways, trade routes that multiple empires used and competed for. And there were basically 3 ships, right? This is a little simplistic, but there were basically 3 ships in the 17th and early 18th century sailing around the Caribbean. The first ship was the merchant ship. These carried the wealth of the empires. Their hulls were fat with mountains of sugar and tobacco, coffee and rum, spices. They moved across the Atlantic under the protection of the crown, respectively. Spain, Great Britain, France, and even the trading companies. They were not just symbols of wealth, but they were actual floating profits. The second type of ship was the warship that carried the empire's authority. They were giant oak islands lined with cannon and commanded by a rigid hierarchy. These ships were there to enforce imperial law, protect trade routes, and yes, even hunt down the pirates. And that brings us to the third type of ship, the pirate ship. These ships could have torn sails, stitched together by whatever cloth could be found. They could have patched hulls with stolen timber and leaky tar. The decks could be crowded with armed men carrying mismatched pistols, rusted cutlasses, and scars through the various battles that they have participated in. To the empire, to the warship, to the merchant ship, these pirate ships represented chaos, criminal enterprises, threatening commerce and order and society. But to the men standing on the decks of the pirate ship, these ships meant something else entirely: escape, profit, and opportunity. Because as we mentioned in the previous episode, piracy wasn't just about violence. It was about economics. We didn't mention this in the previous episode, but in the Atlantic world in the 17th and 18th centuries, the economic system, the global economic system, was known as something called mercantilism. European empires believed that global wealth was limited and that power depended on controlling trade as tightly as possible. Colonies existed not to develop into independent societies, but they were there to enrich the mother country. Raw materials flowed outward, manufactured goods flowed back. And a system like this creates enormous incentives to break the rules. Because whenever governments tightly control the markets, limit competition, or restrict access, unofficial markets always begin to form. We call this black markets. We spoke about this last episode. Think about it as pressure building in a sealed container. The tighter the restrictions, the more valuable it becomes to circumvent that system. A colonial planter wants sugar more cheaply than the imperial monopoly might allow. Merchants want profit margins larger than it's legally possible. And consumers want cheap goods, and they might be willing to risk breaking a little law here or there to get those prices. You know, before most pirates ever boarded an outlaw vessel, they were already living brutal lives. Many began as sailors in imperial navies or on board merchant ships, the two ships we were just talking about. And those worlds were far harsher than modern audiences can even imagine. You guys, life at sea was relentless. Food spoiled quickly under tropical heat. Water became foul after weeks trapped in wooden barrels. Disease spread through cramped spaces at horrifying speed. Scurvy loosened teeth and rotten gums. Storms would destroy ships without warning, and entire crews disappeared into the ocean without leaving behind even a name. And then there was the discipline. Naval hierarchies were absolute. Captains ruled with near total authority. Floggings were a common punishment for disobedience, drunkenness, or simple bad luck. Writers such as Marcus Rediker has described this world in blunt terms when he said, quote, brutal labor, harsh discipline, hangings, and floggings, unquote. For most sailors at the time, the ship represented a system of control that treated human bodies as expendable tools. And yet, even within this world, or shall we say because of this world, an alternative system was forming. As Rediker notes in his book, Villains of All Nations, sailors were escaping these conditions, becoming pirates, and often creating a, quote, starkly different reality on board their own vessels, unquote. An alternative social order, we could say. You see, on pirate ships, Captains were chosen by the crew. Loot was divided by agreed rules, and discipline, while still harsh, was shaped more by collective agreement than aristocratic authority. For a legitimate sailor aboard a merchant vessel, work was exhausting. Wages were low and often delayed or reduced or stolen by corrupt officials. Bureaucracies consumed wealth while ordinary men remained trapped in poverty. For these sailors, survival itself became uncertain. Years could pass with little reward beyond food, barely enough to eat, and promises of another dangerous voyage. You can see how, for these seamen, the allure of piracy might begin to feel less like madness and more like a rational alternative. And all sailors heard the rumors that would spread across port and tavern alike. Rumors of pirates' crew dividing treasure. Rumors of captains chosen by their men. Rumors of ordinary sailors earning more from a single captured ship than years of legal service on a merchant ship or in the Imperial Navy. And it makes you wonder, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, why do people choose this life? Why do people sell drugs? Why do people start Ponzi schemes? Why do people scam with these phishing emails and they scam you on the phone? Because they're trying to escape a system in which they feel like they cannot make their ends meet. So just like the pirates of old, there are pirates today, scammers, smugglers, dealers, people working outside of the normal system and in the dark crevices and corners of the black market. Now, for these sailors we've been discussing, they could not only go to piracy, but they could go to government-sanctioned piracy. During wartime, governments would often outsource their violence to civilians. So instead of funding enormous permanent navies, states would issue, quote, letters of marque, unquote. These legal licenses allowed pirate ship captains to raid the enemy and disrupt commerce. A pirateer, they would call them. A pirateer could seize cargo, capture ships, and profit from the plunder while remaining technically lawful under the protection of a crown. To governments, privateering was efficient. It weakened rival empires without requiring massive public expense. So talk about gray area, right? In other words, the same practices that appeared as privacy to one jurisdiction could appear as lawful warfare to another. Even though most pirate captains were selected by the crew, as we said earlier, pirate ships were not romantic floating democracies in the modern sense. Discipline still existed, and sometimes very brutally. But authority aboard pirate vessels often rested on agreements rather than inherited rank. Before voyages began, many crews established codes governing conduct, compensation, and punishment. Some of these rules were written down. Others passed through oral agreement, but the purpose was always practical. These agreements determined how spoils would be divided, what punishment followed theft, how injuries would be compensated, and what behavior counted as cowardice during battle. The rules were not philosophical manifestos about liberty. They were survival contracts. Interestingly enough, privateer crews often operated under very similar structures. They too relied on profit-sharing systems, contractual agreements, and incentive-driven organization. The state might legalize their violence, but governments rarely micromanaged life aboard their ships. At sea, the captain's authority was almost absolute. He was a dictator. But his authority was never entirely detached from consequence. A reckless decision, for example, could put every life aboard at risk. A captain that was too cautious might cost the crew the prize that justified the voyage in the first place. Even more interesting was the role of the quartermaster. On many pirate ships, the quartermaster acted as a counterbalance to the captain's authority. During battle, the captain commanded. Outside command, power was often shared or restrained. Pirates understood something governments and corporations still struggle with today, and that is concentrated power creates incentive problems, especially when everyone involved carries weapons and depends on each other for survival. This was not about equality. It was incentivized alignment under extreme risk. This is why pirates would even get compensated for loss of a limb, loss of an eye. It's because they wanted to maintain that incentivized structure that encourages risk and courage in battle. When a ship was captured, celebration was not the first priority. The first priority was accounting. We spoke a little about this last episode, how pirate crews placed value on different booty. Cargo had to be inventoried carefully. Weapons needed to be secured and prisoners separated. Valuable goods were identified before confusion or theft spread across the crew. The division of spoils among pirates differed dramatically from the imperial system. In traditional navies, sailors often waited months or years for payment. Pirate crews eliminated much of that uncertainty. Payment was immediate. A captain might receive several shares. Quartermasters, navigators earned additional portions for their skills. Carpenters, surgeons, specialists often earned more money than ordinary sailors as well. Every injury was compensated, as we said earlier. Sailors who lost an arm, a leg, an eye during battle could receive extra shares. It was capitalism, warfare, and organized crime all blended together on the open sea. It is true that pirate ships rejected imperial authority, but that doesn't mean they rejected order itself. In fact, survival at sea depended on internal discipline. Without trust, crews would collapse. Without coordination, ships would fail. And without rules, greed turns into disaster. So even though pirates were themselves outside the structure order, they had order amongst themselves. And I think this is where pirates and imperial navies are very similar. Discipline and punishment were something not to be taken lightly. For example, if you were caught stealing on a pirate ship, offenders were whipped, or maybe you were marooned, abandoned on an isolated island with very little chance of survival. Cowardice during combat could bring either expulsion from the crew or execution. The imperial navies relied on distant courts, royal bureaucracies, and layered chains of command. However, the men aboard a pirate ship became the judge, the jury, and the executioner. Privateering complicated this even further because governments often tolerated extreme violence when it was politically useful. A privateer attacking enemy commerce could be celebrated as a patriot. The same man attacking neutral or allied ships could suddenly find himself a criminal worthy of the gallows. At its core, piracy is not just a story about disorder, violence, or life outside government systems. It's a story about how demand shapes supply when economies are rigged. Whenever demand exists and official channels fail to meet the demand or outlaw it completely, alternative sellers will always appear. European empires tried to tightly regulate global commerce while simultaneously expanding the appetite for every good that flowed through it. But as we talked about in the previous episode, you can't control the ocean. You try to treat it as an infrastructure, as a highway, as a railway. It's open ocean, and there are limits to the amount of control any empire can achieve. And we have piracy today. Pirating today has become synonymous with watching movies or downloading music without paying for it, or making merchandise that are knockoffs of the original. But the label has changed more than the underlying behavior. We will still see it because the economics are the same. When demand stays high and access is restricted, people don't stop wanting that thing. They look for another way to get it. And when the price is right, pirates will come. And in this episode, I hope I was able to show why people, otherwise good-natured people, become pirates. Again, it's about incentive. Why, if I'm a sailor living this brutal, intense life, making scraps, when I can become a pirate and one ship, one prize, one plundering scenario, I make more money than I've ever made in my entire life. When you look at it in those terms, we can at least see how tempting that choice could be. In our next episode, we're going to look at life aboard the Imperial Navy and what the Navy did to try to stop these roving band of bandits on the ocean. Here at Professor Liberty, we seek to educate, inspire, and restore. If you like this podcast, share it with your friend, share it with your neighbor, share it with your communist cousin. You guys, I need you guys to be my hands and my feet and my voices. If you've listened to more than 5 episodes of the 144 episodes, please be a pal, be a friend, be a buddy, and share this podcast with someone you think would enjoy it. If you want to email the show, the email is professorliberty1776@gmail.com. Go to professorliberty.com and you can check out the Proclaiming Liberty blog. I put a lot of essays and thoughts about politics and life on there. And go to teacherspayteachers.com. If you're an educator, or if you're a homeschool parent, I've got activities, worksheets, lessons. I just put like 5 new things on there. If you'd like to help support me financially, go to teacherspayteachers.com and get you some Professor Liberty lessons. Until next time, go throughout the land and proclaim liberty.